Welcome back to the channel. Recently, I reviewed New Mutants number 31 by superstar writer, according to Marvel Comics, Charlie Jane Anders, and I must say I came away very unimpressed with the superstar writing quality. The story reeked of two things that are absolutely destroying X-Men right now: really bad self-insert characters and just terrible fanfic, never understanding how the characters fit into the universe, what makes them special. We've got a lot of self-insert characters in this age of X-Men at Marvel Comics. We've got Steve Orlando Somnus, which is his self-insert character. His mutant power is basically to roofie other characters and have sex with them for 1,000 years. Just really weird stuff. When it comes to Vita Ayala, she had an entire team of self-insert characters. Remember Children of the Atom? Just a terrible comic book where all the characters are transmutant. Of course, Vita Ayala is famous for being trans and non-binary. I don't understand how that works, but she created an entire team of self-insert characters in the Marvel Comics universe, and Charlie Jane Anders created Escapade, a trans character that can also trans into other people's lives. She can steal their powers. She can assume where they are physically. There are no limitations to what this character can do because Charlie Jane Anders isn't a real comic book writer. They're a fanfic writer. And when you're writing fanfic, you don't have to think about how your characters interact with the universe. You don't have to think about the strengths and weaknesses of your characters and how they're going to play out long-term when they come in contact with other characters. So Charlie Jane Anders, naturally, when asked, can this character potentially wield Mjolnir? Yes, of course they can. Even though the character has no power whatsoever and has never proven worthy of anything, including starring in their own comic book. But that's the way Charlie Jane Anders thinks about the character, because the character is flawless, because the character is Charlie Jane Anders, but in the Marvel Comics universe. Naturally, when a new writer comes aboard the X-Men team, there's an interview with Adventures in Portace for X-Men Monday, and Charlie Jane Anders once again proves why this is the worst era in the history of X-Men, because they keep hiring all these terrible writers. This has got Sarah Brunstad written all over it. Let's talk about the first question. Do Escapade switching abilities only work with natural abilities, i.e., can't use their switching powers to suddenly wear the Iron Man suit or wield Mjolnir? This is what Charlie Jane Anders said. Shella could absolutely wear the Iron Man suit, and she could probably wield Mjolnir. But there are some catches. First, she has to be within 6 or 7 feet of someone to use this power, and it only lasts a few hours, because the notion of trading situations with someone is so subjective and so subject to interpretation. There are many ways it can go wrong. Like if Tony Stark was wearing his armor and eating a sandwich, she might end up with the sandwich instead of his armor. I have no idea how her power would interact with the finicky Asgardian stuff. Marvel Comics actually went out and purposely hired somebody to write characters in their universe that refers to the Asgardian stuff as finicky, despite that being a central point and focus not only of Thor, but also the entire 616. And Escapade could probably wield Mjolnir. This has all the hallmarks of a couple of things just plaguing comic books right now: self-insert characters and just bad fanfic. You don't create a character that's going to be a star and a hero and actually going to do some things within the Marvel Comics universe without thinking, how do they interact with that finicky Asgardian stuff? How do they interact with Iron Man? What happens if they come against Doctor Doom? What are the key strengths and weaknesses of the character? You can tell Charlie Jane Anders doesn't even know the limitations or even how Escapade's powers work within the Marvel Comics universe, because that's not important. It's not about creating good heroes that work within the universe. It's about creating self-insert characters so Charlie Jane Anders' own vanity can shine very bright with their own avatar in the Marvel Comics universe with no knowledge or comprehension of how this power set would even work. Not to mention, it's already pretty damn redundant if you think about a couple of the other mutants already on Krakoa, most notably Synch. The big difference is there are limitations to what Synch can do, although they have done some things with him lately that I don't think work with the character, and they even have tried to put in a couple weaknesses with him using his power to sync up and take other mutants' abilities. This character can literally steal your powers, steal your life, physically steal where you are, steal your car, can steal anything, because there are no limits to what she can do. When you're writing fanfic, you're really only writing it for yourself, or perhaps a couple of close friends that are also interested in this and want to support you on your journey of being a fanfic creator. But now Marvel Comics are hiring these people and putting them in the actual universe. And the worst part about all this is apparently Marvel Comics have been wooing Charlie Jane Anders for years now. Question: what was the process like for getting Escapade into not just New Mutants, but the wider X-Men mythos? Essentially, how did this opportunity come about? This is what Charlie Jane Anders had to say. I've been having meetings with folks at Marvel for several years, and at some point we started talking about having me create a new character, which is such a cool opportunity. We started developing Escapade to premiere in last June's Pride issue. Just getting to introduce Escapade was incredibly cool, and I sweated over every page of that story, but then I was told that Vita Ayala was stepping away from New Mutants, and there was an opportunity for me to bring Escapade to that title. Since Shella is a young mutant who still has a lot to learn, having her show up in the definitive title about young mutants and growing up felt utterly perfect. Marvel Comics and Charlie Jane Anders have been working together, conspiring for years now to debut as a writer in Marvel Comics, and Escapade is literally the best thing that they could come up with. A character who's already redundant within the Marvel Comics universe. They've had years to think about it and never came up with how does the character's power set work? What are the limitations of what the character can do? What would make a good foil for the character? How can we put the character in jeopardy? None of that was important. Nothing about writing a good comic book story, a good action-based story, was important to Charlie Jane Anders and Marvel Comics. The only important thing, apparently, was getting Charlie Jane Anders as a writer in Marvel Comics. How many people do you think bought New Mutants number 31 because it said superstar writer Charlie Jane Anders on the cover? And it literally says that verbatim because that's how Marvel Comics sees the writer. The problem is none of the readers actually think that. I think maybe really on their best day, that name on the comic book cover drew in another 24 purchases in total, maybe, if it all went well. The worst case scenario is people recognize the name Charlie Jane Anders from IO9 and go, I fucking hate that person. Why would I ever want to spend money to buy a comic book and read it by a narcissistic activist who doesn't care about comic books, the heroes, or the universes that they're created in? Marvel Comics went out and intentionally did this. They developed a character and did nothing with the character because that was never important. That is a hallmark of everything just destroying Marvel Comics these days. It's bad fanfic. It's terrible self-insert characters. And it's Marvel Comics thinking that they've got their hands on a celebrity when really what they have their hands on is a stick of Acme Dynamite that's waiting to blow up in their faces as everybody exits the building and loses faith in Marvel Comics as a brand. And even worse than all of that, and one of the reasons New Mutants number 31 is just absolutely terrible, is fully explained when they asked Charlie Jane Anders about what the best New Mutants runs are. Actually, I don't think that was the question, but that's basically what the answer ends up being. What's your relationship with New Mutants in general, and do you have an all-time favorite New Mutant story? This is what Charlie Jane Anders had to say. Vita's run is probably my favorite, especially now that I can see how they honored years of storylines. And I love their idea of having the original team around to nurture a group of younger mutants. But I also really love Jonathan Hickman's first storyline, in which the New Mutants just go off on a totally irresponsible space adventure and commit grand larceny. I hope to bring that same chaotic energy to some of my comics writing. The original incarnation of this version of New Mutants was an absolute disaster. It had two writers, Jonathan Hickman and Ed Brisson, and they were writing two stories that had nothing to do with each other. But saying Vita Ayala's run is your favorite New Mutants run of all times, right there disqualifies you from being an X-Men writer. You don't know anything about good comic books if you think Vita Ayala's New Mutants run is even readable, let alone one of the best New Mutants runs of all times. I understand that taste is subjective, and we are all going to like certain things better than others. But there has to be a point of objectivity in this where we can understand what are the good stories and what are the bad stories, because we don't want to write more bad stories. We want to write more good stories. What worked about the good stuff? Why did the bad stuff fail? If you can't understand why Vita Ayala's New Mutants run is terrible and why it failed, you probably shouldn't be writing New Mutants in the future. If you're an editor that was associated with that run, and I am looking straight at you, Sarah Brunstad, you probably shouldn't be associated with the X-Men in the future because you weren't able to identify what was going wrong and course correct and get a better story out of Vita Ayala. Believe it or not, I have read a good story from Vita Ayala. It was in the Wonder Woman 80th Anniversary Anthology Special. It's only about 8 to 10 pages, but it's damn near perfect. It's like a 5-star comic book, although it is very limited. Clearly, with the right guidance, you can get a good story out of Vita Ayala. The editorial team in X-Men have not been able to do that. Terrible writing across the board. Yet this is what Charlie Jane Anders is looking to for inspiration. Another issue that's plaguing comic books that is addressed here indirectly is I don't think a lot of the creators these days, specifically the writers, have any concept what other people actually feel about stuff. They're so obsessed with weird shit that it comes through in the comic books and makes them very off-putting and really unrelatable because they're pushing something nobody in the world cares about but the writer. Question: will younger mutants like Enole have more chances to shine in this run? This is what Charlie Jane Anders has to say. I'm pretty obsessed with exploring how our bodies shape our view of the world, and I had a lot of intense conversations with a friend who's a therapist about the way that your body is involved in processing trauma and how Cerebella's new body might actually bring up a lot of stuff for her about her past. Why isn't Charlie Jane Anders obsessed about Oreos or something like that like normal people? That's why we get these terrible stories filled with self-insert characters, just terrible fanfic, and they're just unreadable nowadays. This is the worst era in X-Men comics history. I talked about it with Doc recently, and I also reviewed New Mutants number 31, Charlie Jane Anders, superstar writer, making their debut in Marvel Comics, and it was an absolute train wreck. If you would like the details on why this is so terrible and really back up a lot of what Charlie Jane Anders was saying there that I pointed out was wrong, definitely check this one out if you don't see it here. There's also a link in the video description.